Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you had a chance to connect with the environment around you during that break and also looked after your body's needs. It's been lovely to see the chat continue and the conversation connection continue. Um, we're now going to have a session on the unimaginable. Exceptional times require an exceptional type of imagination. And in this session, author Dougald Hine and anthropologist Michal Osterweil will be in conversation with Gabriella. They will take a journey on untethering ourselves from our current realities as it is now and step into the unknown and beyond, exploring the tension between the entrenched and the disintegrating, and the possibilities that are available to us in this time between worlds. This session is also pre-recorded, so we will start that session now, and please do continue sharing reflections in the chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first conversation of Imagination Infrastructuring, A Time Between Worlds. I am very happy that this will be the session that will be starting us off. And even though for a whole day we will be talking about imagination and what is possible through it, we thought that we would start off also having a conversation about the unimaginable and what that actually entails in relationship to the rest of the conversations that will be happening today. So an interesting fact is, as author Jane and futurist Jane McGonigal has pointed out, that in the year 2020 and 2021 alone, there were 2.5 million news stories in English with the word unimaginable in them, and even over 3 million stories with the word unthinkable. So we had a pandemic that was unimaginable, border shutting down was unimaginable, flight stopping was unimaginable, and a few years earlier, a Trump coming into power was also unimaginable. Climate change is upon us, and it feels unimaginable as well. So as you probably read in the introduction to this session, one of the things that we're really interested in teasing out is the fact that perhaps exceptional times require an exceptional type of imagination. And in the midst of multiple and historical planetary crises, there's a big question to be had. How do we walk ourselves into what we cannot entirely foresee at this moment? What happens when we untether ourselves from reality as it is now and step into the unknown and then take a step beyond into the unimaginable? So it's a big treat today to start this conversation and these provocations with Michal and Dougald. And then after they start us off, and they will share some of their thoughts on how they reacted to this prompt that we sent their way, then we will have a very loose, three-way, informal, hopefully meandering conversations about the possibilities and perils of a time between worlds. And I hope that we do this tightrope walk between the critical and the possible, because as Maria Popova has said, the unknown in life, the unknown in ourselves, the unknown of the world is always a double-edged sword of thrill and terror. So I myself, I'm hoping that the provocations that are shared today will both thrill us and terrify us and keep with the times at hand. So thank you so much, Michal and Dougald, for joining us. Then Dougald, if you could just start us off and lead us into the conversation, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Well, here we are. Greetings from the small town of Osterweil in Sweden, from the old shoe shop, where we're slowly dreaming into being a school called home. And as I was listening to you introducing the session, Gabriella, I was appreciating the invitation maybe to bring some fruitful hesitation into the kind of leap into imagining. And I say that as someone who's often been kind of asked to step into rooms where we're being convened around the project of imagining a sustainable future, imagining the better world, and then being able to kind of build backwards from that, and having developed a bit of gentle skepticism about that over the years, and then inquiring into that skepticism to look for, well, okay, what are the seeds of possibility, rather than that just being a kind of critical response. And I find myself thinking, as I'm talking to you now, of somebody who died very recently, Keith Johnstone, the great improvisation teacher, who just died at the age of 90. He's somebody whose two short books, Improvisation and the Theatre and Improvisation for Storytellers, I learned a huge amount from, and clearly very many people learned a huge amount from his practice as a teacher of theatre and comedy improvisation. But there's one bit in particular from his first book that comes to mind, because when you ask how do we walk into these strange worlds that we find ourselves in and headed towards, Johnston has a chapter where he talks about improvising stories. And he says, when you're improvising a story, you should be like a person who's walking backwards, who's not trying to look at what's coming next, but looking for the moment where you can pick up one of the dropped threads from earlier on and weave it back in. And when those moments happen in storytelling, they generate a powerful experience for you and for the audience. And I always think that experience has to do with a sort of sense of meaning at the point where we're able to weave the past and the present together. And one of the things that image of sort of walking backwards into the future, firstly, it seems to me, to the extent that it makes sense to describe our experience in terms of this kind of past, present, and future of linear time, which might be a parochial approach, but it seems phenomenologically true that we move with our backs to the future and facing towards the past. And Johnston seems to me to give us a more hopeful version of that image, of that stance, of that way of being, than the famous mid-20th century image of the angel of history from Walter Benjamin, where the angel is sort of being blown on the wind, which is blowing out at the storm that is blowing out of paradise that we call progress. And that storm is what makes it impossible to mend all of the damage that is visible in front of this figure. So I guess that's a sort of invitation to a way of being without pretending that we can actually see. I mean, improvisation literally means the absence of foresight, being able to act without being able to see ahead. And that seems to me like a kind of stance, a set of practices that might be very helpful for the kinds of times that are around and ahead of us. So then the other thing that came to mind immediately for me under this heading of the unimaginable is a phrase from my friend Vanessa Andreotti, who I know is also going to be speaking as part of this event. And there was something that I heard her say lots of times before it really landed with me. She would use this phrase, presently unimaginable futures. So futures that aren't imaginable in the present. But what I got in the end was that what makes these futures presently unimaginable is that in order for them to become imaginable, we have to be changed. So this is sort of the opposite of the invitation that gathers a group of mostly pretty privileged people in a room together with good intentions and let's kind of spend the weekend brainstorming the new story or the vision of a sustainable world that we're then going to build a path towards. It's to say that no, rather than the work being a work of imagination, the work is a work of being changed. And that has to come first. And Hospicing Modernity, Vanessa's book, is full of exercises and practices, and I'm sure she'll be speaking to you about some of that, that give us clues as to the kinds of humbling, disconcerting, confrontations with the present. Because let's face it, part of the reason why it's so tempting to assemble groups of rather privileged people and engage in exercises in imagining the future is because it's difficult for us to imagine the present, to actually be with what the present implies for lots of other people whose lives are tangled up with ours, but who we don't necessarily meet very often. And so the future can become a refuge. We can be imagining these shiny futures as a way of not having to be with the pain of imagining all of the things that are implicit in the lives that we're experiencing right now because of the way that the world is ordered right now. So that phrase, presently unimaginable futures, was coming to me. And then I was thinking of an Italian philosopher, Federico Campagna, whose work I got to know when I was just coming to the end of writing At Work in the Ruins. And he talks about ruins as well. And he has this beautiful line of thought where he basically says, sometimes you're born into the ending of a world. This is a thing that happens. You know, it's not the first time. How do you tell that you were born into the ending of a world? Well, the symptom of it is that the future no longer works, because the future in the ordinary sense is a continuation of the story that you're within. And when a world is ending, its story is ending. And it's important to distinguish between the end of a world and the end of the world in capital letters. And this was, you know, this is where we landed, Paul Kingsnorth and I, at the end of the Dark Mountain Manifesto. In the closing lines, we said, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop. So what Campagna says is, so if the story that you were born into, if it's coming to an end, then when people try and talk about the future in the ordinary sense, as a kind of projection from the recent past through the present towards some promising continuation, that no longer sounds convincing. And I think this is part of what we've been seeing in some of the kind of morbid symptoms, if you like, in politics in many parts of the world over the last decade, is, you know, the exhausted quality of attempts to appeal to the future in the kind of classic rhetorics of modernity, and the potency of appeals to the past, which is part of what kind of comes into play when you're at the end of that existing story. This is not to say that the appeals to the past in the forms that they are arising right now are good or helpful necessarily, but they are again a symptom of being at the end of the arc of this world that many of us were born into. And so Campagna's reading of this is, he says, well, what can you do if it is your discernment that you were born into the ending of the world that you were born into, that its story is coming to an end? He says, well, you can stop worrying so much about making sense according to the logics of the world that is ending. And you can start going about trying to make good ruins, because the world that is ending is not going to vanish without a trace. And obviously we know that some of the traces of the world that is ending are going to be toxic traces that are going to be around for tens of thousands of years for whoever is around to live within our ruins. But that's not the whole story of the ruins that are going to be left behind by the ending of the arc of the story of modernity, the ending of this world. And so to actively contribute to leaving things that are unfinished, things that can be picked up and used in ways we can't imagine just now, among the legacies of the world that is coming to an end. I guess that's sort of Federico's invitation as I hear it. And maybe one last thought from another friend who passed away last year, Gustavo Esteva, who I remember listening to him tell the story that he told many times of the three turnings of his life, these three occasions from his early 20s and then onwards at various points up to the middle years of life, where he walked away from what looked like a promising situation. You know, he walked away from this job as like the youngest ever executive at IBM in Mexico in the 1950s, and then he walked away from the Marxist guerrilla group that he joined after that because he suddenly understood the violence that they wanted to unleash on society and he couldn't be a part of it. And then at some point in the 70s, as I heard it, he basically turned down a job as a cabinet minister in the incoming government in Mexico and instead went to work at the grassroots in the barrios with landless peasants and indigenous migrants arriving in the poorest neighborhoods of the city. And what was really clear when I listened to him tell that story was the discomfort of that moment of turning, because he couldn't explain to himself satisfactorily, let alone to anyone else, why he was walking away. He had to actually go without being able to give any good answers, and then be in this other place, in these other circumstances, doing that work painfully feeling the failure of the ways of knowing and the forms of expertise that he had embodied at that stage in his life, before he could get to the place where it became possible to see things that he couldn't see when he was in that office in the government buildings in the center of the city. And I think there's a lesson there as well about the unimaginable, that, again, a bit like Vanessa's thing of we have to be changed, we have to be transformed before those presently unimaginable futures can become imaginable. Similarly, sometimes we have to walk away from the position that we've been in, because from that position, the possibilities that remain, the things that are worth working for in the worlds to come, are hidden from view. And it's only taking the risk of leaving that might get us to a place with no guarantees where we can see possibilities that are currently hidden from us.
I love that. That's beautiful. Thank you, Dougald. The unimaginable as a moment of turning. Michal, would you like to add some of your thoughts?
Sure. Oh my gosh, it's so lovely to be here, and I already have like so many things I want to just like keep going on with what Dougald said, and I just find it really inspiring and affirming to, like, some of our people point of view. I've worked with Gustavo a few times, and so we have, and Vanessa I've met, but then there's names I'd never heard of, and it's just so beautiful to like have new places to go and learn from. And so I just wanted to really pick up on a couple of things, because I think I guess there's a zeitgeist, right? It's often happening. And so the unimaginable or imagination is something that I've really been, it's not that I've been turning away from, it's more the question that I think Dougald asked us, picking up on Andreatti, about like, we need to change. This imagination that we think we have now isn't going to get us, to the next world. And Jack Halberstrom, I think, is often quoted as saying, we cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn shit down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break. And both are necessarily different from the desire that issues from being in the break. And for me recently, where I need to go to be able to do that is into my body, right? Into my body. And it could sound a little cheesy, I realize this, but into my heart. And I think that I think a lot about the nervous system recently. I think about the nervous system, both in terms of our individual nervous systems, but then also the collective nervous system. And trauma is a big buzzword these days. And I think it's important, but I also think it's more complicated than how it gets sort of picked up, right? And so I'm an Israeli-born post-Holocaust Jew. There's plenty of ancestral trauma in my bones, and then my ongoing participation as an Israeli subject, right? Like, there's so much I could talk about. But what I'm actually interested in is understanding the ways in which trauma is not the event. It is getting stuck in a constant repetition to something that was too much, overwhelming, that froze us in time, right? And so I see our society as completely stuck in repeating habitual responses, right? And those habitual responses, if you think about them, they're quicker than we have time to reason with them. They're like, fight, flight, freeze is the one we talk about in the trauma language. But if we think about that on a collective level, right? So I really want to pick up on that idea of slowing down, right? Like, we really, really need to slow down. And I kind of want to just string a bunch of quotes from my favorite people. One of my favorite contemporary thinkers, Bayo Akomolafe, says, we hardly have any spaces for falling apart. We need to slow down in order to fall apart, right? We don't know how to stay in the indeterminacy and the slowness of the compost. We just want to get back into the game, right? And that's exactly what you were saying. Like, we just want to get together with a group of people and say, let's imagine. And honestly, where I am most excited these days, but also it's very uncomfortable, is to be in the place of like slowing down to feel the dying, to feel the discomfort of the falling apart and the death of this civilization and this culture. And I really want to echo that, we as privileged, as a white-bodied person, as a privileged person, like, so many people have experienced the death of their worlds. Nick Estes talks about being a post-apocalyptic, he's talking about post-apocalyptic futures as, an Indigenous American, United Statesian, I don't even like the word American, right? So I really want us to think about that. So where I get excited about the idea of like really slowing down in order to know what our habitual responses are and so that we can start to act differently, right? Because it's in that, and sitting is a good way to do that, right? But also the other thing I really love about the knowledge about the nervous system, right? There's this Peter Levine. I'm a very eclectic student of many things that have helped me individually, but then I look to them as they help us maybe think about society. So Peter Levine is someone who's helped a lot of people deal with individual trauma. And what he noticed is when you look at animals in the wild, they don't really experience trauma. They have difficult experiences, right? They get attacked by a predator, but their body knows what to do to complete the motion. And so many of us humans, right, either because mostly because we were unable to, we were little or whatever, we couldn't complete the action, right? So it's like when you see an animal getting attacked and they go, right? Like it's like the nervous system discharges the adrenaline and the cortisol and all the things that they needed, right? What would it look like as a society if we got to complete the things that have been stunted, right? Because we know that powerlessness is traumatic, right? So much of our incapacity right now to think and do differently has to do with being frozen and stuck. And it's not just about trauma, how we normally think like a terrible event happened, but like just the fact that we don't have the power to choose the course of our lives. Like we have these dreams and stories, like the American dream, right? 9-to-5 job, salary, white picket fence, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I work with students and they're 18, 19, 20, and I see this and they like, I almost cried when you read that line about, sometimes you've been born into the ending of worlds, and how you know that is that the story no longer works, because everyone I'm working with knows it, but we as humans, we hold on to what we know so desperately, right? That like I've studied social movements and social change for decades now, and I'm always struck by, how much, even when we're excited about the future and we know this way doesn't work, at the last instance, we're still going to vote for Biden. We're not going to, we're still going to do the things that hold on to the functionality of these institutions, because the fear of the unknown is so much greater than our ability to slow down and be with the like falling apart of thisness, right? And so cultivating those capacities to be with that indeterminacy, cultivating our capacities to be with the unknown is such the place where I am looking now. I have no idea how much time. Can I just write something in the chat to me, please? So yeah, so this idea of like learning how to let go. And I honestly think that image you said about Vanessa Andreotti is like, we have to be able to like change ourselves. So much of what's in the way of changing ourselves is the way we like, I see it on an individual level. Like I get into a fight with my partner and I do the same thing the next time, even though I know it's not helping me in any way. I haven't slowed down enough to like learn that I actually have a choice in my moment. I don't have to react. I can learn to respond, or actually say, I don't know how to be differently right now, but I am not going to do the same thing I've done over and over again. And I am terrified by that because I'm terrified. I don't know what comes next if I don't fly off my handle, right? If I fly off my handle, I know the thing, it happens, If I vote for Biden, I know what happens and it sucks, but at least, I'm not terrified by the unknown. So there's these like parallels of the work we can do individually to like get into our bodies, and also slowing down and finding ways to slow down collectively in a way that allows us to cultivate these capacities for not necessarily imagining, but like being with the dying, right? Being with the hearts breaking, right? So that's one of my points. And then getting a little bit more maybe political. One of the other things I think that that really gets in our way, and it's an example, I guess, of the holding on, is the way in which we as activists or political beings, right, like get stuck in these ideas of what's realistic, right? Like what's actually going to make the change. And we get stuck because our scale, if you look at where we can actually control things, the scale is pretty small, right? And the body is pretty like present and it doesn't seem momentous, right? And so I've seen over and over again, I recently got reviews back from the manuscript we just finished, and I had this like white man basically like just me for being so naive and romantic, and not just me, my set of co-authors, right? And at first I was like, oh, I'm sure he's right, like I'm just being naive and romantic. But I've seen this done. Like at one time I was talking to, I can't remember his name now, but he was from the party in Spain that had just won after 2011, and he was just like dismissing the Zapatistas as having been a failure. And I was like, really? What? And he's like, because they didn't change the world, right? But like the scales that we have to look at are the worlds, or they are worlds, right? And so really, like, in those moments where someone's smarter, or in a male, whatever, what like tells you that you're being naive or romantic, like really remembering the realism, or the reals, the multiple reals that we are actually inhabiting. And political realism is one of our biggest traps. And I think that we are often, and I've watched activists and movements and myself and students and everyone get stuck in these, like, undermining the thing they knew in that emergent moment of effervescent, like, power, when we are actually creating new worlds in the streets or at a new school where we're like sitting together and like really feeling the possibility of being differently together, right? And then later someone's like, yeah, but what was that? That was like a Sunday morning and you spent 2 hours, you didn't do anything, right? And it's like, how do you hold on to these other reels, right? How do you hold on to these other reels? And one of the things that I think we have to really get better at is the multiplicity of registers that we can be working on. Because on the same hand, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't work for the UN to say a different thing, right? I'm not dismissing that work, but I am dismissing the idea that that's like the only place that really matters, right? And one of the things that I've really been thinking a lot about is how this happens, how we can be so excited about horizontalism, decentralization, carnival, these things that when I was studying the alter globalization movement, and then Occupy happened and Ignados happened, and we had all these like effervescent moments. And then like literally a couple of months later, everyone's like, we failed, right? We failed or they failed, right? Depends on the perspective. And I started to think about these, like, we just like slip back into the old story, right? We slip back into the old stories. That story, the story of modernity, isn't just a narrative story that we know the parts of. It depends on what we sometimes call default settings, right? It's like the water we swim in. People know the parable of the fish, right? There's like two little fish swimming and they're just swimming along and an old fish comes by and he's like, how's the water? And they keep swimming a little bit later. And they're like, wait, what's water? And Gustavo has a different way of talking about it in terms of like needs, right? Like no one knew they had needs until development workers started talking about that, right? So we have to start naming the water that modernity, modern capitalism rests in, and the entities that we know to be real in that modernity, the individual, right? The state, all these entities that are assemblages that have come about and are very real are not the only possible way of being in reality. And we all have experienced these other ways of being real, right? We all have experienced the collective power of no longer being an individual, right? Like we all are not individuals, right? But we have this strong story that we're constantly socialized into. So recognizing the default settings of modernity and then cultivating the capacity to constantly catch ourselves as we slip. Because one of the things that I think is really beautiful one of our traps is dualism, right? It's either this or this. And it's not. It's like the slippage becomes the portal. The slippage becomes the place where we can actually be in two worlds at one time. And this in-betweenness, which is so difficult and so uncomfortable, becomes this like beautiful land of possibility, even though our words might not be sufficient, right? And this, again, I get back to like, I have a lot of teachers that are spiritual at this point, like mindfulness teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh, also teachers from my root traditions, but concepts are just tools. They aren't sufficient, right? So we use them as they're helpful, but then it's getting into a relationship with the real, right? And the way that real is falling apart and the words aren't going to be sufficient, right? So again, I'm at time, so I'm going to end on that last bit. Just the idea that we really, we need to find, I love Arundhati Roy talked about maybe this pandemic being a portal. That's sort of where we got that word from, but I've seen it elsewhere. And that we're going to be in this other story if we allow ourselves to fall apart without trying to be so here. Like there's a real discomfort because it has to be, like you said, like we don't know where we're going. Sorry, I take, yeah.
So it's wonderful to hear you both. And as you'll probably notice as the conversation unfolds, you actually have and reference some similar folks. So I think that this is a really lovely conversation, both in the places that you diverge, but also similar ways of thinking. And when we were putting together this conversation, you both hold two ways of thinking about the unimaginable in my book, and I'd love to know if this is true as well for how you think of the work that you're doing and the things that you embody. Because on one hand, we have the unimaginable, as you've both so eloquently spoken about, of the things to come that we cannot foresee necessarily, because we've come to the end of our stories, to the end of a time, to the end of what we can actually foresee or predict with all of our instruments that kept us safe and tethered to reality as we knew it. But on the other hand, I also find it incredibly interesting to know that a lot of this unimaginable actually is about not necessarily having understood reality from a different perspective or from a different register. So we have our default settings, as I think you've both pointed out in very eloquent ways. And for example, Michal, I'm really intrigued about the last book that you wrote with Arturo Escobar, for example, that as you know, he will also be in conversation later in the day today. In terms of the relational, we don't necessarily have a language for relationality. We don't have a language of paradox when thinking about dualistic terms, where paradoxes are no longer paradoxes when you actually change and shift the views from where you look. But it actually entails very profound shifts of how we have understood even being human. Like the moment that we understand humanness in terms of its individuality without its entanglements with everything else, that very much walks us into what we are right now living through in many ways. Dougald, on your hand, I'm really intrigued by both many of your book's premises in terms of the work in the ruins and all of these things of staying with the times at hand. And perhaps also that you've also eloquently spoken about that our epistemological or ways of knowing that we have right now are perhaps not cut to the task at hand. And I don't mean that 1.5 or 2 increase of degrees that is coming in the next decade, but what the world is living now, like the ways of knowing this reality and the ways of inhabiting this reality, and the thinking that science is what keeps us tethered and safe to understanding what we're living through now, as well as what is to come, has actually gotten in our way, that, and as I think you very eloquently spoken about, of, you know, just yes, let's think with science, but also know that that's just one way of knowing and inhabiting the realities that we're living through now. So Dougald, for starters, like, could you speak a little bit about this? Am I right about my perception of both, you know, the darkness, the things that we cannot foresee towards the future, but also perhaps the things that we're not perceiving from the now? And then Michal, I'd love for you to also speak a little bit about this in-between thing that you're speaking about. That again, like there's some languages that can point to this in terms of, like, you know, the Japanese ma that speaks to the space in between, but we don't necessarily seem to have the tools, the optics, the knowledge structures, the pedagogies of approaching some of these spaces.
Thanks, Gabriella. And there's so much to speak to there. And there's a line that I have near the opening of the book where it came out of a conversation with the philosopher David Abraham. And somewhere in this kind of half a day that we spent in dialogue together, this phrase came up: the end of the world as we know it is also the end of a way of knowing the world. And so that question becomes, for me in the book, since I don't think any of us would really want to kind of joyfully wash our hands of all of the things that have been done and brought into view, and all of the knowledge and practices that have emerged from the history of Western science over the last 4 or 5 centuries. How, you know, the way of knowing the world that belongs to modernity, that has been affirmed by modernity, and this is literally, you know, the word science means knowing what is known. How and in what forms does the work of science survive the ending of the world within which the story of science took shape? So that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book, and part of that has to be a kind of porosity to the boundaries around science with a capital S as it has been defined around here lately, which is not just, that's not a kind of lazy laissez-faire, whatever you want it to be true is true, kind of dissolving of the boundaries. It's an attentive looking at the places where the boundaries never made as much sense as we were assuming they were doing anyway. And so I try and bring some of those stories through in the later part of the book. But the other thought that was coming to me as I was listening to both of you was, I wonder if part of the difficulty we have is just what we think imagination means or calls for. Because I feel like we're sort of acculturated by modernity to think, oh, right, okay, we're going to do imagination. So what we need to do is, a kind of design project for the world that is coming next. And if I try and say, I don't think that cultures are designed things. I don't think that worlds, I think that there are forms of design that play a part in the kinds of world making that have been dominant around here lately, but I think that might be part of how we got into this trouble. And I think that there might be, and so what I was trying to think about now is, if I were asked to give an example of, okay, what does imagination that looks nothing like kind of design and coming up with a plan to be implemented, what does it look like? And I remembered a story that my partner told last week about her Palestinian mother, as she says, is a woman who she worked with and who basically adopted her into her family in the West Bank, and whose own mother is now very old and has what we would describe as dementia. And Anna was describing a conversation she'd had recently with Yumna, who was saying of her mother, I envy her ability to be both in her childhood and in the present at the same time. Now, what's happening in that is an act of generosity. It's not like, it's not forced, it's not fake. It's a genuine, way of stepping into the situation of being at the point where your very elderly mother has now reached that kind of stage where the rope tying this person to the ordinary relationship to time that most of us have has been loosened. And to be able to step into that situation with all of the practical things that it calls for and all of the strains that it puts onto the family, and inhabit it with that gesture of saying there is something to be envied in her ability to be existing in these two times that matter to her at the same time. It's like, it's beyond just being okay with it. It's discerning something beautiful within the trouble and the difficulty of it. And what I heard myself saying in the conversation that we were having at the school about this last week was, what I hear there is a kind of imaginative generosity that is born out of the experience of hard times, because it's what's called for as part of how you keep going and make life work in hard times. And I mean, I could as easily be thinking now in terms of, some of Viktor Frankl's stories in Man's Search for Meaning, about, the role of culture and imagination in the hardest of circumstances. And so I think just maybe as we're in this bit where we're helping people hesitate around the rush to imagination, part of that hesitation might be to say that there are utterly different ways of being imaginative, that kind of creative generosity that emerges from the need to make life work under difficult circumstances might be more helpful to navigating the times ahead than the forms that we immediately reach for if we're coming out of the centers of Western modernity and thinking we're going to do the work of imagination now. So I guess that was the bit that I wanted to feed in at this point.
Oh dear, you said so many great things. Now I'm forgetting what Gabriella asked me to speak to, but I wanted to pick up on, the creative generosity that comes out of these hard moments. The crisis contemplation consciousness is something that Barbara Holmes talks about it. And so there's yeah, there's a creativity that emerges when you actually are in the thick of things, when the world is falling apart, and that's where you are, right? And the Western, I think part of our problem here in the West, the privileged side of that at least, is that we are always searching for stability, or we're always assuming that the imagining process and the design process is a stable, right? That's what we're looking for, right? So I think design is like, I think design is a part of the world, but when we move to and you were asking us about the book, like relational design, which is sort of what we're trying to discuss in our book, actually, it's like the world designs you back, right? Like it's not I am a thinking Cartesian mind and I get to make this plan for the world, right? It's a inextricable network of mutuality. And so there is no thing that we produce, that we can create, that doesn't then have these unexpected consequences. And what we have done in modernity is sort of keep like stunting or getting stuck with this idea that it's like a one-way, I think, therefore I make the world, right? And we don't realize how it is making us back. And then we impose this on so many peoples whose way of being is actually more in the flow of making life, right? And so that is so much, we do this everywhere we go, right? We damage other cultures' capacities to continue to make themselves and to make things in a processual way. And then we have lost sight of the fact that that's the absence of our creativity, right? Yeah, I'm trying to think of, Gabriella, what else I would want to say at this point in terms of relationality as it's such a difficult and beautiful adventure to try and shift from the non-relational to the relational, even though intellectually I've been writing about it, for years now. But there's this thing that happens precisely because once you just move into the fact that paradox is not paradox, right? Like we only experience paradox when we look for conceptual resolution. Conceptual resolution is a form of stability. It isn't necessary. Mess is, right? The undoing of things are, and in life we experience that, and that's fine. But the modern scientific even mind, one could say, like seeks to neaten it up, right? What you said about the boundaries, absolutely. Because scientists, if you really ask them, they know there's so much noise around the edges. Like there's not a perfect answer about any of this. So the idea that we have these perfect, clean stories and outcomes is a myth that we have, like John Locke calls it the one world, like we try to constantly produce these neat boundaries around a one world when the mess is always there. And it's actually fine. And the ability to hold these pluralities is something, again, as we cultivate what we would need for, an imagination suitable to these times, is to cultivate the capacity of being with that. And so, I like to use the example of, there's the story of how what we've done with predators, right? Like, so farmers were like trying to get rid of coyotes, because coyotes were killing their chickens, right? But in a complex ecosystem, right, the predators were actually doing a very important thing for the balance of the ecosystem, right? So a predator is only bad in a non-relational worldview, right? There is really no good or bad. And so even this notion of darkness, right? Like how often we need the dark to explain the light, or to even learn that, right? There's all these things that if you do either or look one way, but if you do both and, right, like become necessary, right, for the coming through of something different. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I find interesting is the tension between what you just said, this loosening up, this coming undone, the massa confusa of the world, the fact that everything is in complete dynamism, and the boundaries that we have placed upon them are more an invention, with another thing that I think both of your work speaks deeply to, which is the importance of narrative and story and how we inhabit it, and how that creates the realities upon which we live. So, this whole thing of homo narrens, if you will. So it's not only Homo sapiens, it's not only Homo ludens, not only the creature that knows, the creature that plays, but also the Homo narrens, that we narrate ourselves to ourselves. And then that's actually many times what we're built upon. So creating meaning, creating story. You have both mentioned trauma in different ways in your writings and referenced it as well right now. And many times one of the definitions of trauma that I've come across, for example, is not being able to wrap things in a story, that it becomes ineffable and overwhelms our sense-making capacities to an extent that it becomes trauma. Although, as you've both spoken of, it's also the recurring story. That first we tell ourselves that story and we have voice and we feel heard. And then if we get stuck in it, and I think both of you have referenced this in your own work, then that's actually when it becomes like an entrenched narrative and it becomes reality itself. So I'd love if you could both speak a little bit to these tensions. Do we need a language for this? Do we need a language for relationality? Do we need languages for working in the Rex? Do we need a new vocabulary such as grief and composting, and maybe something that has been entertaining my brain as of late, which is fermentation, which I also think is a beautiful analogy, because besides it's things taking on a life of their own that are also very much like composting, you know, the things that are happening in symbioses and deep entanglements being what they are, but then also becoming something else. So if you could react to that as well and talk a little bit about this, I'd be grateful.
Shall I dive into that? Wow. Yeah. I was thinking about these questions about, you know, do we need a language? It's also kind of what kind of language do we need? What do we think we're doing with words? What do we think we're doing with storytelling? I mean, I remember studying English literature as an undergraduate in the 90s and being in the sort of like somewhere within the trickle-down effect of the impact of the kind of postmodernist and post-structuralist theory that had kind of caught fire in recent years without fully understanding any of the context of that at the age of 19. And one of the things that sort of my impression of it at that stage was there was a kind of a mournful quality to a lot of this talk about meta-narratives. It was almost a sort of ghost modernism, that it was a kind of state of being haunted by the confident forms of modernism and no longer being able to believe in them, no longer being able to feel that confidence, but nonetheless feeling that the lack of the things that it had seen as necessary was just as real a lack as it would, as modernism and modernity would assert. And none of that seemed obvious to me. That you need the kind of big, God's eye view perspective forms of knowing and speaking and describing the world and narrating the world. It seemed to me that the kind of closer to the ground for here and for now, rather than for once and for all, forms of knowledge and forms of narration were enough to be getting on with. And that as far as I could see, anthropologically, it seemed like people had got along with those kind of closer to the ground forms of knowing and narrating forever. And something weird had gone on around here for a few centuries, where we suddenly felt the need for this much more kind of total and tightly gripped form of narrative and form of knowing that had to know everything and see everything and be able to name everything in order to even do anything. And that we're sort of weaning ourselves off the addiction, or kind of composting the structures that were built out of that way of approaching the world. And part of what that language of composting can give us is it can also give us a way of speaking to the need to release the resources that are held within the big dead trees of institutions and structures. That, part of what has to happen in the ending of a world is that the things that may have made sense to be bound up within very big, very heavy, very top-down structures for periods of time, or just very large-scale structures, that those get composted down and released, and have to be, in order for the new fermentation, the new possibilities of life to be emerging. And that's not comfortable, especially for those who are having to kind of, I often see it as being strange collaborations that become necessary in these kinds of times between people who are often kind of deep inside existing structures with their eyes open to how far we are into the ending of the world in which those structures made sense, but not necessarily able to see very clearly from there what possible moves there can be. And I feel like one of the things we're trying to do with our school is trying to create spaces and pockets where we can bring people who are, who recognize themselves in that description into dialogue with people who you might not immediately think would find themselves in the same room or want to sit around the same table and have a conversation. It's almost like part of the work that's called for is a bit like the work of peacemaking. It's kind of, I went to the European Commission a few years ago and I was asked to speak in this thing that was around climate change. And I said, look, you know, what's at stake is not making the ways of living of the Western middle classes sustainable. What's at stake is negotiating the surrender of these ways of living, like decommissioning this in a way that, you know, that minimizes damage and harm and releases resources and releases us from the trap of, you know, anything beyond trying somehow desperately to make these ways of living sustainable being unimaginable. So, you know, those are some of the places that this goes to for me, I guess.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. And I guess I would just add, I do think that there is a role for new language, right? And new stories, but it's again with this other understanding of what language does for us, right? Like it's the tenor of confidence, right? Of domination, of control is no longer what we're looking for with the words. Also because, especially as I work with young people in the United States, right? The belly of the beast, like they feel the death of the future they thought they wanted, and they need a way to talk about it. But as I talk more about vulnerability, and I'm going to move into this last about like the kind of different kinds of knowing that we already all have. And I think that's one of the things, there tends to be this sort of like denial of the multiplicity of ways of knowing within modernity, right? Within those of us who live in the modern. And I think the reason I said earlier, sort of like, it's a little cheesy, but I truly, truly believe it about knowing from the heart, right? There's like, you know, we all know that many people, you know, when you face death, when people have a terminal illness, they become more alive, right? Like these weird paradoxical ways in which when you're at the limit of something and you lose someone dear to you, you know, you appreciate things in so much more vividness, like the texture of life becomes just infinitely stronger, right? So it's these, and the way that I understand the knowing of the heart, right? It's like, you know, it's a feelingness, right? So it's like, the terror and the beauty are like very closely linked, and that sort of deeper well from which we can pull and be alive and learn to then story our worlds, right? We get more access to them as we don't just stay though in the realm of words. I think that's why it has to be really like connected to these experiences, collective experiences. I think breaking this idea that we are individuals is such an important piece of any new story, right? And that we can talk about it all we want, but until people feel it, they're not going to know it, right? And so, but really also working to give new, like, you know, there's so many popular authors these days that, you know, I love parts of them I don't love, but like giving importance to vulnerability, right? To talking about the heart, talking about things that we are sort of afraid of saying because they seem cheesy or woo-woo or they've been poo-pooed, right? And there's a poo-poo that comes from the cynics in the sort of activist left. And then there's the poo-poo that comes from the dominant culture and how these strange collaborations that happen on both ends of that, right? I think that, I think we really need to talk about that. And also just, I recently in my class, a student was like, you know, I would probably be really embarrassed to admit what we do, but it really works, Dr. O. That's what she calls me in class. So it's like, you know, the fact that we have these spaces and we can also say, like, we know we wouldn't tell everyone else about that, but we're building the capacity to have new stories in some of the spaces. And in so doing, we know that they're not the only story, right? They're like, they're less dominant. They're less aspiring to that way that you described it so beautiful, Dougald, the sort of arrogant certainty of modernity's narrations. But also, and I think this part that you said about looking back, I think, you know, one of the big things that characterizes modern peoples is we are disconnected from our past. We are disconnected from our ancestors. We are disconnected from the lands we come from. And I think that it's a really, really important thing. So I mean, in my own very small way, right? Like I was a secular, you know, post-Holocaust Jew, so I wasn't very Jewish, right? But in recent years, like I find source from some of the things that happen on the mystical end, at least, right? And, you know, the Midrash, which is you know, it's an interpretive practice of the Torah. So it's like built into God's, whatever, supposedly God's, you know, meta narrative are multiplicity. It's like, it's never been one. It's never been one, you know? So even being able to show people that are traditional is what I want to say, right? Like we are already accustomed to having these multiple stories that don't need to be the total and univocal truth.
It's
And just to build on that last bit, I think there is something happening that I'm seeing with, with friends who have roots in each of the monotheistic traditions, that in the last 5 years, some people having very powerful experiences of being reclaimed by their traditions, other people in a gentler and more and quieter way, just having a degree of homecoming, partly out of a recognition that it was too easy, it was too cheap, the way we went around the world, borrowing other people's traditions and thinking that we had no rituals and practices of our own. And also, it's partly exactly what I hear in what you were saying, Michal, that the kind of big meta narratives, they're not actually the theological traditions. They're precisely what happens when this move happens in modernity, where the modern subject is somehow put in place of God. And there is an implicit humility in recognizing that I am not God, which is lacking from a lot of the ways of knowing and speaking that have dominated modernity, which is not to say that that slippage isn't one that's always there as a risk within traditions that are focused on a kind of, on a singular voice of the divine. But there's something that's happening there, a kind of ancestral reconnection, which also has to do with, modernity had its shadow projection of tradition as this monolithic thing, which only ever existed in the museums that modernity built. That's not how tradition has ever worked as a living thing. And Gustavo used to say, in Mexico, we have a great tradition of changing our traditions traditionally. And we did here too, and people are beginning to find paths back into dialogue with that. And I think that's part of what's called for.
A dynamic universe that is alive and everything that happens within it. I really enjoy hearing you both, and also it makes me think in terms of language and what language does, as Michal was asking. And in terms of also this almost stereotypical phrase nowadays, the limits of my language is the limits of my world, that perhaps it's the language at the end of language and time at the edge of time that suddenly becomes something interesting to think about. And very much following, let's say, for example, in this beautiful essay by Audre Lorde of Poetry is Not a Luxury, that there are languages that are more akin to an embodied feeling or to another state and another way. And that in and of itself might be a bridging point or a threshold space or a liminal space between these different ways of knowing that we've seen. I'm also quite taken by what I've heard you both mentioning in terms of what comes undone, which is obviously very much one of the principles in your book, because perhaps there's also a choice there of what we help to be ruined, if you will, no? And what comes undone. I think of something else that crisscrosses your work in terms of the undoing of the demos of Wendy Brown, where she speaks about, the homo economicus. So it's not the homo narrens or any of these others that I've gone through, but this economical man that has swallowed up our whole planet and our whole ways of making meaning. So that's perhaps something that I believe to end with, since we're nearing time, that perhaps we could speak about the things at the edge of things, the language at the edge of language, of time, of ruins. Any of closing thoughts that you have about that, or anything else that you want to bring us home to, I would be very eager to hear.
Well, I guess I could share the place that I land at the end of the book, which is just a kind of back of an envelope list of 4 kinds of tasks that might make sense in a time of endings. If we are trying to name what the work among the ruins might look like, because that's the title of the book, At Work in the Ruins. So the first one is to salvage the good things that we have a chance of taking with us from the world that is ending, because there are achievements, there are knowledges and practices within modernity that we would not gladly lose. To mourn the good things that we're not going to get to take with us. And as part of the work of mourning, to tell the stories, because the stories can travel with us, and some of those stories may turn out to be seeds in worlds that we can't imagine yet. The third thing is the work of discernment, the chance that we're given in a time of endings to notice the things that were never as good as we told each other they were about the ways that we've been doing things around here lately. And then the fourth one is that thing, going back to Keith Johnston, How to Tell a Story, of looking for the dropped threads from earlier in the story, the things that have been marked as old-fashioned, obsolete, forgotten, no one knows how to do them anymore, that have actually been surviving at the edges or below the radar within our societies, that might turn out to make all the difference as we improvise a way into the unknowable, unimaginable futures that we are stumbling and dancing our way into.
Wow, I don't have like a very nice succinct tying things together. So the language at the end of language, again, I really, I've been really in an inquiry of, you know, what it means to be free, right? Like this question of freedom and liberation, and the practices that we need to like truly be free of those dominant stories that have like kept us attached to things that aren't really that good for us, right? And I think the one thing that I can find, and again, it's going to sound a little cheesy, is love, right? And I think that there's this, rather than give my own words, there's this poem that we actually start our book with, and I'm wondering if it's okay if I just read it. And it comes from actually a climate activist. You might have already heard it. She's like 20, I think, when she wrote this. And she titles it, "On another panel about climate, they ask me to sell the future, and all I've got is a love poem." What if the future is soft and revolution is so kind that there is no end to us in sight? Whole cities breathe and bad luck is bested by a promise to the leaves. To withstand your own end is difficult. The future frolics about, promised to no one, as is her right. Rage against injustice makes the voice grow harsher yet. If the future leaves without us, the silence that will follow will be an unspeakable nothing. What if we convince her to stay? How rare and beautiful is it that we exist? What if we stun existence one more time? When I wake up and get out of bed, my 7-year-old cousin with her ruptured belly tags along. Then follows my grandmother, aunts, my other cousins, and the violent shape of their drinking water. The earth remembers everything. Our bodies are the color of the earth, and we are no bodies. Been born from so many apocalypses. What's one more? Love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. For what it's worth, I do this again. Gamble on humanity 100 times over. Commit to life unto life. As the trees fall and take us with them, I'd follow love into extinction. It's by Aisha Siddiqa.
Wow. That was an incredibly beautiful, rich, but also incredibly dense session where we were encouraged to shift away from our default settings, to think about our orientation, walking backwards into the future, to reflect on how we need to change, and our active participation in this work, how we let go of the logics of the world as we know it, because these stories no longer work, and shift from non-relationality to relationality. I know that there'll be many people that will be familiar with lots of those concepts, and many people here for whom a lot of those concepts will be very new. But I encourage you also to slow down. You don't have to absorb it all at once. Take what you can now, and you'll be able to come back to this and all the many resources that are being shared in the chat over time. With that in mind, we now have a break and we'll be back at 11:20.